Hello students, I am going to create a video which should help you in preparation for the illustration portion of the final exam. I might have to break this into two parts. Here I have a list of features that I want you to use for that particular project. So if you can see, drop shadow, gradient mesh, gradients, gradient on a stroke, gradient on text, blends, envelope, distort. So what I might do is break this up into two parts, and maybe the first 4 items I'll include in the first one because I have a 15-minute limitation to the videos that I can distribute. Anyway, getting started, drop shadow. Fairly straightforward, a very easy operation. Simply have an object, a selected object, your selection tool. Actually, as long as it's highlighted and selected, you can apply this effect, stylize, drop shadow. Turn on your preview. These default settings are perfectly fine. Click OK. There you have a drop shadow applied to an object. Gives you a nice bit of illusion of depth. Get rid of that. Moving on. Gradient mesh. We did our little fruit projects. So any object. Here this one will have a gradient on it. Actually, I'm just going to start it, figure out what the base color is. Red, and we're going to apply or convert this object into a mesh object simply by using our mesh tool. Click anywhere in the object and you can see a little plus sign. Now it's a mesh object. I have two mesh lines with a mesh point at the intersection. These behave just like paths with control handles, and if I wanted to create something that looked kind of fruit-like, I would build up a fair amount of mesh lines in order to apply some color. Let's say I want to have whatever type of fruit this is. I want to create a sort of a dark spot where the stem goes in. To do that, if you want to isolate color in a gradient mesh, and I'll just zoom in a bit, here what you need to do is have a series of mesh lines in order to stop the color from spreading. So I want to apply some color. I'm going to put a few mesh lines. So really what I want, I'm going to choose a mesh point, and I can use my direct selection tool, and I'm going to target this point right here. And if I change that color, watch what happens. I'm going to actually go to my color panel. If you don't see all these sliders, just go to your the drop-down menu, the flyout menu in here, and there should be an option to show options. That will give you your sliders. So with that targeted, I'm just going to move, here I'm mixing in RGB color mode. I'm going to move my red slider towards the black portion of the slider. And you could do other ones as well if you want. I think that's about as deep as I want to get it. Okay, so now I have color applied to that mesh point, and you can see how it transitions and it stops the spread of that color. If I didn't have these mesh lines here, that color would transition much further. Okay, so now that I've applied the color, I can do a few other things simply by using my direct selection tool. So I want to create the spread of that where the pit goes in, or excuse me, the stem. And I could also do things like move these mesh points to make it look like that portion of the fruit is going in. It gives me a sense of depth. So you see how that was done. And then I'll show you the next couple steps. We can use the blend tool to create a stem. Okay, so without getting too much into all the detail of the fruit, but that's a good starting point. So let's go back out to fit in screen. There's your mesh object. Okay, so that was a gradient mesh. So basic gradients. Here I'm going to keep that in reserve. And I'm going to create kind of an interesting background with a gradient applied to it. Here by default was set with black. Okay, we have a selected object. We can choose a preset gradient from the swatches panel, but we could also use the library. And I'm going to go to my gradients and choose one of the color, actually the brights. The brights let's see here. There's some other ones, so what I'm going to do. There. So within the library, I'm choosing the simple radial. And let's use some sort of contrasting color. Let's put it on a purple background. And you can see how this radial gradient was applied to this rectangle. You can see how the color starts in the center and radiates out towards the edges. So if I want to adjust this gradient, a couple of ways I can do that. One, by going to the gradient panel. There I can adjust my gradient sliders in the gradient panel. And here this top triangle is also known as a gradient slider, but it's the midpoint of color. And also, if I didn't want this gradient to radiate from, or move it, that point to another point within the rectangle, I could use my gradient tool. Notice when I do that, what happens is that you get a dashed line that shows you the extent of the gradient. So while using that tool, there's a few things that you can do. One, you have the same type of control that you do in the gradient panel, but actually on the gradient itself. Two, you can adjust the roundness of the gradient. And here, the overall scale of the gradient. But also you can move that center point of where the gradient starts. So within the square, you can give it yourself a nice highlight. Okay, so let's move this. I'm going to bring that to the front. So it gives it kind of an interesting background, kind of highlighting the object within it. Okay, so that's basic gradient editing. Let's just, we're going to keep that. Okay, okay, one more feature, gradient on a stroke. So you can see here, this is a typical or normal way that a gradient's been applied, and this has really been the case for many versions of Illustrator. It wasn't until this latest version, CS6, where you got the ability to apply a gradient to a stroke. This is a gradient to a fill. So watch what happens. I'm going to create a simple stroke. 1, 2. It's not filled. Just make sure I do a swap from the stroke to the fill and select my selection tool. I'm going to reselect it. What that does is make available in the control panel the stroke options when I have a selected stroke. So I want to give this a little bit more body. And you can see as I grow that, what's happening is this stroke now has a gradient applied to it, and this is the default. It's as if you had a very narrow rectangle with a gradient applied to it. So if we want to edit this, the way that the gradient travels along the stroke, you need to go to your gradient panel. And here, with that selected, stroke selected, you can see you have a series of options. And I'm going to switch it to linear. And the next 3 set of options here is one is within stroke, so that's like you're having a little window. The next one is along the stroke. That one really didn't show much in the way, but the one I'm interested in is across the stroke. So now what we get is something that looks like either tube, and to enhance that look, I'm going to alter the gradient by duplicating this color slider. So I'm going to alt drag this, and there we have a rather nice looking sort of like straw. But I want to show you some of the other things that you can apply to a gradient in addition to applying apply to a stroke. In addition to a gradient, I want you to use this particular feature and what's called the variable width profile. So right now this is a 14-point stroke, but I'm going to apply more shape options. So here the default is uniform. I'm going to apply this called width profile 4. So now that gives me a look of a very sort of long spike. Okay, so I'm going to end this particular one, and we'll move on to the next one in the next video. Thank you.